They're denying reality. There are videos of these raids when ICE agents get violent and hit people and detain them in a very violent manner. The DHS is essentially saying, no, they don't just deny reality themselves, but they're telling people, don't believe your eyes.
The government is always capable of lying, whether it's on the right or the left. The government is always capable of using power, whether it's on the right or the left. And we should perpetually be a little bit skeptical of the government's assertions when it's claiming the authority to do things as potentially dangerous as mass immigration enforcement or mass lockdowns or mass anything.
The Trump administration's mass deportations agenda is sweeping across the country, and it is violating the rights of immigrants and Americans alike. And most of us have seen footage of federal agents entering homes without a warrant and using excessive force against individuals and terrorizing the streets of America, as in the case of Chicago. And it is bad enough that this is happening to anyone on American soil, but what many don't know is that this is happening to American citizens as well, and many don't know the extent of the disregard for the rule of law that is involved in this immigration policy. Welcome to the Ayn Rand Institute podcast. I am Agustina Vergara Cid, and today I'm talking to Josh Windham, a senior attorney at the Institute for Justice who is suing the federal government for violating the constitutional rights of his American clients through immigration enforcement. And naturally, Josh is very familiar with what's going on with Trump's mass deportations agenda and how it is impacting constitutional rights. Welcome, Josh. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks a bunch for having me.
So, Josh, I would like to begin by asking you about this case that I just mentioning. You are representing Leo Garcia Venegas, who is a U.S. citizen who was detained twice by ICE officers in a construction site in Alabama. And you're also representing other U.S. citizens because it's a class action. So can you tell us a little bit about this case and why it's a rule of law issue, not an immigration issue?
Yeah, sure. So my client Leo is an American citizen of Hispanic heritage. His parents are from Mexico, but he was born in Florida, and under the Constitution, that makes him a citizen of the United States, despite what the administration might tell you about that. He is a construction worker by trade. He's lived in Alabama, since high school, and he's now in his mid-late 20s, and he has worked for a fair amount of time without any issue with ICE until earlier this year when Trump took office, and then ICE started ramping up immigration enforcement all over the country. Southern Alabama is a part of the country where there's a fair amount of new construction. A lot of homes are being built up, a lot of new properties are being developed, and so ICE has decided to, and when I say ICE, I'm speaking broadly about the Department of Homeland Security's sort of broader immigration enforcement apparatus. We'll just call them ICE on this call, but there's a few other agencies that are involved in this immigration enforcement effort. But anyway, so ICE ended up focusing on Southern Alabama as a big kind of hotspot for some construction site raids. And so Leo was caught up at a couple of these. The first raid occurred when he was working on a site where he was going to go lay the concrete foundation for a home with a crew of other construction workers. His whole crew of workers were also Latino like himself. There were a few other non-Latino workers in the area. There were 2 white workers and 2 black workers who were standing nearby when this occurred. And when Leo was on the site that morning getting ready to lay some concrete, a squad of ICE officers, ran onto the site, jumped a fence, walked past the no trespassing signs on the construction site, and just started detaining everybody. A couple of his coworkers left the scene. The ICE officers chased them down. Leo's brother and Leo stayed on the scene. The officers started tackling Leo's brother without asking him any questions, without identifying themselves, just went straight for him. And Leo started recording on his phone. When he did that, the officers came for him and tackled him, and it got pretty aggressive. He was tackled by, initially 1, but ultimately 3 officers. He repeatedly said throughout the interaction, he's a citizen, he has a real ID. The officers ignored the other workers on the site, the non-Hispanic workers. They just ran right by them. and went for all the Hispanic folks. And ultimately, they found out that Leo's ID was in his pocket. They pulled it out. They saw that it was a real ID, and they said, this is fake. Put him in handcuffs and detained him for about an hour. His real ID is not fake. It's a real ID. Alabama happens to be one of the more stringent countries or states in the country in terms of identification and ensuring that driver's licenses and real IDs are up to snuff. They adopted that set of rigorous laws because they wanted to cooperate with federal authorities in enforcing immigration laws. And so the fact that Leo produced his real ID, the officers saw it should have been sort of enough to get him out of that situation. And they said, you know what, we're going to keep detaining you even though you've shown your papers effectively, right? So that was the first incident. After he was, held for about an hour, there were officers who checked his social security number and decided to let him go after that because they realized, oh, we have a citizen on our hands after he had told them that for, an hour. 2 weeks later, he was working on a different site inside of a home this time. Again, the property was marked, right? He was in a home that was partially constructed, and the officers went into the home, ordered Leo to come out of the home, rounded up all of the other construction workers who were throughout this development that were building homes and put them in a big lineup. And, Leo did show his real ID that time too. Initially, they said it could be fake. We have to go check you out. Detained him for 10, 20 minutes and then released him later on. So on both of these occasions, one of them got pretty violent. On both these occasions, he showed his real ID. The officers either said it was fake or it could be fake and justified that to do a further detention of him. Again, all of this was without a warrant. All of this was without the consent of the property owners or the construction workers involved. And all of it was, as we allege in the case, without any reasonable suspicion or probable cause that Leo was doing anything wrong or was an illegal immigrant. And so when you ask, is it a rule of law issue? It is, because the Fourth Amendment prohibits government officials from acting in this way. It requires them to have a warrant or consent to enter private property, requires them to have reasonable suspicion if they want to temporarily seize somebody to ask them questions, and it requires them to have probable cause if they're going to arrest somebody without a warrant. And so all three of those constitutional guardrails were violated during these raids. And there's a set of, I think, very important regulations that are adopted by the Department of Homeland Security that reinforce all of these constitutional rules that say, when officers are going to enter the non-public area of a business, like a construction site, they have to have a warrant. That say, if they want to temporarily detain somebody to ask them about their immigration status, they have to have reasonable suspicion. And that say that, if you're going to arrest somebody on suspicion of being an illegal immigrant or committing a crime, you need probable cause if you're not going to get a warrant. So, there's a series of both constitutional and regulatory guardrails that are in place that are meant to protect people from exactly this kind of abuse. And so that's why we filed this lawsuit.
I found it interesting that the complaint challenges these three, what it calls policies, used in their task force that is or was operating in Alabama. And I find it interesting that it calls them policies. So it's not that they are mistakes, right? So these three policies are warrantless entry policy, the preemptive detentions policy, and the continued detentions policy. So why do you claim that these are actually policies and not just, one-time mistake that these agents, happen to make?
If they were one-time mistakes, we wouldn't be seeing them all over the place, right? Like, part of why we're alleging that these are policies of the Department of Homeland Security is that you can just look around and see that what happened to Leo is happening to countless other people. It's happening to other people in Southern Alabama, where we filed this case. It's happening to people in DC, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, all over the country. You see similar stories to what happened to Leo. So this is not an isolated incident. This is not, kind of a few rogue officers being bad apples. This is how the agency is operating on a systematic level all over the country. And so that's why we're seeking broader relief. Now, you probably saw the Trump versus Casa case about universal injunctions come down. There was a lot of public discussion about that. So that limits our ability in some way to seek, nationwide relief for these kinds of abuses and these kinds of policies. But We do think it is a nationwide policy. We think it's being enforced in Southern Alabama against construction workers down there. And so we think consistent with that CASA decision, we're able to at least seek relief within the judicial district where Leo is suing. And we're also, of course, as you mentioned, seeking class action status. And so, if we get that granted, that would allow us to represent a class of not just Leo himself, but of other, American citizen construction workers and folks who have lawful status, who are in the country legally, who are working, legitimately on these sites and who are doing nothing wrong.
So these violations that you mentioned earlier, including these Fourth Amendment violations, would be violations of constitutional rights, regardless of the citizenship or the immigration status of the victims. Is that correct?
Yeah, so there's a few things to say about this. First of all, the Fourth Amendment and the regulatory provisions that I mentioned, they're part of the CFR. So if folks are interested, it's 8 CFR section 287.8, which is kind of the part of the code that lays out restrictions on immigration officers' enforcement powers. And all of that protects citizens and non-citizens alike. And there's a really important reason, if you just think about, restraints on government power, why that would be. If you think about the First Amendment, the government doesn't have the power to censor. It takes a power away from the government because that power is a dangerous kind of power, right? For the government to wield it at all is per se dangerous. And so the Fourth Amendment and this CFR provision operate the same way. They say the government just doesn't have a particular kind of power. So in the Fourth Amendment context, it's the government can't do unreasonable searches and seizures. It's not a legitimate part of the government's authority. It doesn't fall within the scope of what the government exists to do. And so whether you're a citizen or a non-citizen, the government just doesn't have the power to do this sort of thing.
Right. And so you mentioned Leo produced proof that he's a U.S. citizen, and it was disregarded by these officers. And I actually know of at least one more case where this happened. Actually, another IJ client, George Redes, who told them repeatedly that he was a U.S. citizen, and they seem to really not care about that. So if a U.S. citizen who actually showed a real ID still was handcuffed and detained, what does that tell us about how secure anyone's rights, U.S. citizens or not, really are with this sort of this administration's mass deportations agenda?
Yeah, I think it's scary, honestly. If you're somebody who thinks you've gone through all the steps the government is requiring you to take to prove your status, right? To show that you are somebody who's here legitimately, and even that's not enough. I'm not somebody who's a huge fan, even at the outset, of this kind of show your papers mentality and culture that the government is cultivating. It doesn't strike me as conducive to a free society that we could walk down the street and be demanded to show our papers to be here and to live our lives. But even if we assume that premise is valid, that the government can kind of cultivate that kind of culture, and stoke that kind of fear in people, you should be able to sort of navigate that by following the steps the government tells you are the proper steps, right? So if they say it's really important that we all have a real ID, it's really important that, if you have a green card, you carry it on you. If you have a visa, you carry it on you. And you do those things and the government disregards it anyway, you're left powerless. You're left at the mercy of the whims of the government at that point. And so you are not living in a free society. You are not living under a system of objective law. At that point, you're at the mercy of whatever the official who detains you wants to do to you that day. And that is a scary society to live in because it's really not a society at all.
Is there any requirement at all for U.S. citizens to have to, carry with them proof of citizenship?
No, you're not required to do that. You're not even required to talk to a law enforcement officer who starts talking to you on the street unless they tell you you've been detained, right? But otherwise, you're not required to have a conversation with anybody, much less show your papers. You mentioned that you knew of one other story of a person who was a citizen, sort of being treated this way, and that was George, IJ's client. But even in this case, we filed a motion for a preliminary injunction. That's pending with the court right now. It's sort of going through a briefing process. But we filed some evidence with that motion and some affidavits from other people. And, there's other people who had different kinds of identification who were treated this way. There was a guy named Giovanni Alverde Ruiz, and his affidavit's really interesting if you go check it out. But he's somebody who came home from a construction job. So he left his construction job, got to his house, and there were federal immigration officers waiting for him at his house on his driveway. And they ordered him out of his car. They demanded he said, I have a green card. I'm here lawfully. And they took him to a detention facility after seeing that and held him. And the detention officer who was at the facility said, these are the best fake papers I've ever seen. And so he was held for a fair amount of time before they finally released him and realized that he was actually a legitimate green card holder. But I mean, Agustina, imagine if you were treated that way, right? If you got home after a hard day of work and you were accosted and told your papers were fake, and just because of how you look and the job you do. And that's the way that people are being treated right now. If you happen to be, Hispanic or Latino, and you happen to work kind of a manual labor job or a low income job or a blue collar job, that's often enough for DHS and ICE to detain you, to interrogate you, to arrest you, to tackle you, to treat you pretty much however they want to treat you. And that's just not. It's shocking to see, honestly. I'm shocked that I'm seeing it, and I'm privileged to represent folks like Leo to fight back against it. But more than that, I'm honestly just pretty sad that we've gotten to this place.
Yes, and there is a recent report by ProPublica that documents at least 170 instances of U.S. citizens being detained by immigration enforcement agents. And that was, I think, 2 or 3 months ago. I think that it's possible that there are more cases now. But also, Josh, recently the Supreme Court allowed these roving patrols by ICE in the case Noe v. Vasquez Perdomo. And in his concurrent opinion, Justice Kavanaugh said that it is permissible to target people due to what you just mentioned, their, quote, apparent ethnicity, as he called it, I believe, and that combined with factors such as speaking Spanish or the type of job that they do, for instance, a job in construction. And he said that being stopped on those grounds is only a minor inconvenience, and that questioning by ICE agents or immigration agents is typically brief. But we have seen that is actually not the case at all. You were telling us about this case where the people were detained, including I know George Redes, the other IJ client, was detained for 3 days and held incommunicado, right? So what do you make of Justice Kavanaugh's opinion? And do you think that the Supreme Court will hold that view, Kavanaugh's view, when it rules on the merits of the cases that are coming their way about these sort of detentions?
Yeah, I mean, just to walk through a few elements of what you mentioned there. So I think it's important for folks to understand, because the Supreme Court can be a little bit, if you're a layperson, kind of hard to get what's happening all the time. So a lot of cases have been going up to the court very, very quickly in abnormal postures recently over the last few years. There are cases involving kind of emergency orders from courts, often either temporary restraining orders or preliminary injunctions, which are like demands to move very fast and for the court to issue an injunction like super fast to prevent like an imminent harm. And so this is not the way normal cases are litigated. Typically cases are litigated much more slowly. There's a process of discovery. There's maybe a trial. And so these emergency type cases where the parties are demanding relief super fast against like government action or something like that, those are all temporary injunctions. They're all temporary forms of relief that are designed to keep people safe or protected or property protected until the case is over, right? Until the case can reach a final decision on the merits. And I mention all that just because a lot of cases reaching the Supreme Court or reaching the court on appeals from those early decisions, the government is sometimes preliminarily enjoined or temporarily enjoined from what it's doing, as in the case of Vasquez Perdomo out in Los Angeles. And then the government seeks what's called a stay of that order. And a stay is sort of do the opposite, right? So they've temporarily enjoined us, undo that while the case is going. And so they're sort of fighting about this early preliminary form of relief that somebody has gotten in the case. And I say that because it's not a merits decision. It's not a decision about like who's going to win on the constitutional issues. That's one of the factors that courts think about when they're deciding whether to grant an injunction or a stay at an early stage. But the Supreme Court's decision in Vasquez-Perdomo was actually a decision on whether to stay the district court's decision preliminarily enjoining the alleged roving patrols in that case. And so we can't read the court's stay decision as a decision on the merits. The court didn't give an explanation on behalf of a majority of like what it was thinking or why it issued that decision. I just said, we're going to grant the stay. Justice Kavanaugh did have a one justice concurrence on his own, so we can read him as sort of like one of nine, right? Not speaking for the court, but just sort of voicing his own thoughts on things. And I don't really know how far to take that in terms of reading the tea leaves. Of course, you had three dissenting justices, the kind of three liberal justices who all argued he was wrong about the kind of, what they're now calling Kavanaugh stops, but these sort of like racial profiling stops, right? They think he was wrong on the Fourth Amendment, but the rest of the justices, the other five, said nothing. So right, so we just don't really know how they're all going to come out on this. At least for Justice Kavanaugh, though, I don't think he's on the right side of these Fourth Amendment issues. I think he's, doing what the court has consistently said over the last, few decades. Courts should not be doing when assessing reasonable suspicion and probable cause, which is to speak in generalities. I mean, those are supposed to be individualized determinations that officers make about people, right? So you're not supposed to be able to paint with a broad brush about demographic groups or large populations under the Fourth Amendment. Officers are supposed to assess people as individuals on individual terms when making assessments about reasonable suspicion or probable cause, whether you're talking about, committing a normal crime or being in the country illegally. So I think he's, on the wrong side of the law there, but, we'll see what the court ultimately says about all this stuff. I do think that his concurrence has sort of sent a signal, though, across the country that people are really picking up on. ICE, I think, feels very empowered by what he wrote. And I think lower courts are now kind of working through how to navigate what he said and like how seriously should we take it. It's not the law, it's not precedent, but it's something to think about. And I think one thing that helps us about his concurrence actually is that he said, look, these are supposed to be brief, temporary detentions. If you're going to stop somebody to question them about their immigration status and it turns out they're a citizen, if you're a citizen, you should have nothing to worry about, Kavanaugh tells us. Well, Leo Garcia Venegas has something to say about that, right? I mean, he showed his real ID twice. He's a citizen and he was not let go immediately. He was instead subject to further detention and held in handcuffs. And so I think the factual premise of what Justice Kavanaugh wrote is wrong. And I think it's really important that we sort of convey that as these cases sort of work their way up the appellate chain and go back to the Supreme Court, because if one of the key premises that he had in mind when he was writing that was actually false, that may sway him on appeal, right? And so I don't even think Kavanaugh is somebody who's necessarily a lost vote or anything. I think he might have just had maybe a factual misunderstanding about what's actually happening on the ground all over the country.
So you mentioned that Kavanaugh's opinion may have empowered ICE agents and some other agents that are doing immigration enforcement across the country to continue doing this. Another thing that I think is empowering them, I think they are truly being, this is my speculation, but they might be being told that there are literally almost or any consequences to their behavior, no matter how appalling it is. One thing we have been observing is that the Department of Homeland Security has taken no accountability for, instances of misconduct that are recorded on video of their own agents. There was one case where I forget exactly who at the DHS said this is unacceptable and we will remove this person, from his position until we conduct an investigation. And then that person had been very violent towards a woman in a immigration court, and then that person went back to work, I think less than a week later or something like that, and we never heard more about that. So I think in your suit, you're trying to hold individual ICE agents accountable, but I understand that is very hard to do actually due to qualified immunity, because clearly we're seeing that the DHS is not wanting to hold their own agents accountable for misconduct. So can you say more about about why it is so hard to hold agents accountable and what effect it may have in this enforcement if you actually succeed in holding the agents involved in the Garcia Venegas case accountable?
Yeah, I mean, so the case seeks what's called prospective relief, which is relief that would seek to protect Leo and others who stand in his shoes moving forward, right? So that's an injunction, a declaratory judgment, some relief under what's called the Administrative Procedures Act. But all that is relief that would sort of get a court to say what is happening here, these alleged policies are unconstitutional, and so they cannot continue to be enforced against people in this region. So that's the prospective relief side. That's the part that I think has the potential for like broad impact today, right? We're also seeking retrospective relief, as you mentioned, which is effectively damages against the individual officers who did this to Leo. So those damages would only go to Leo if you were to prevail on those claims. And as you mentioned, it's really difficult to hold government officials accountable for violations of their constitutional rights. Generally speaking, we don't have to go into all the details of this, but there's a whole kind of network of different immunity doctrines that protect officials in different ways, including qualified immunity, from, pretty blatant violations of the Constitution. And I think if, we were to prevail in sort of reining some of those back, which is a big goal we have at IJ under our project on immunity and accountability, we're trying to rein in a bunch of these different federal and state immunity doctrines, so that people can actually vindicate their constitutional rights and get some money damages when they're violated by the government. If we were to prevail in doing that, I think the impact it would have on actual effective law enforcement is pretty negligible because, and there's been research on this, but officials are generally speaking covered by insurance policies that protect them from personal liability for negligence. And so even if they were subject to tort liability or subject to personal liability for violations of the Constitution, that's not really going to destroy their lives or anything. It's just going to be money that an insurer pays for, or that they're otherwise indemnified for by the government, in most cases. And so I don't really think it's going to have much of an impact on effective law enforcement. But I think on the flip side of that, what we've seen when the government has sort of this perspective that we can do whatever we want and we're untouchable, right? You can't do anything to us. I'll never pay a dime. That's a pretty dangerous precedent to set, because then you have folks going out there in the world holding guns, having, wearing badges, wearing, often SWAT gear or military uniforms, and roving the streets and treating people often aggressively or in demeaning ways and threatening them. And all of this was sort of an air that they can never be held accountable for what they're doing. And so why would you be cautious if you're in those shoes? Why would you be careful about what you're doing if you're in those shoes? I just think that it's not a good thing to tell people in government positions that you can do whatever you want and you'll never be touched, right? I think, we want people who are cautious and careful in those positions because they hold sort of the ultimate power that we have in society, which is the initiation of force, or at least the retaliatory use of force. And so I think if we had to choose between a world where government officials can be held accountable and a world in which they can't, we should choose the accountability side of things. But I do want to follow up on another thing you said earlier about DHS sort of not taking accountability for some of this stuff publicly, because that has been one of the more concerning parts about all this for me. Starting to really tap into this stuff in the middle of this year as we start to think about filing this case and to sort of watch what they've been saying and how they've been communicating about all this. It has been deeply disturbing to me to see, federal officials at the highest levels, and then even things like the DHS Twitter account, which might seem kind of minor and not important, but you're sending a huge signal to citizens, right? When you do something like tweet from a government account. So I think it's really significant how they're communicating and how they're holding themselves out to the public. And what you basically have on the one hand are people who are unwilling to admit their mistakes, right? And these are not inconsequential mistakes. These are we are treating citizens like criminals, right? We are treating peaceful, hardworking people who have done nothing wrong, who are lawfully here, like they are criminals and like they deserve to be locked up and thrown in cages and handcuffed and tackling them and, treating their papers as fake. And that kind of thing is the sort of thing that if you're seriously focused on lawful immigration enforcement, you should be embarrassed by that. You should think of those as egregious mistakes that you want to correct and not commit in the future. And instead, they're just unwilling categorically to admit when they're making mistakes. I mean, after we filed this case and after we publicized, seeking damages in Georgia's case, they labeled our case as fake news, right? Like DHS had a press release that was like, these are fake news cases. And it's like, it's one thing to say, we dispute the arguments they're making, we dispute their precise factual account of what happened, but to say that like a citizen wasn't detained, right? To say that, and this is even crazier. They'll often just say, like they did in Georgia's case, oh, he was getting violent with officers, right? After Leo's first arrest went viral, they accused him of interfering with an arrest. He wasn't even close to the arrest of his brother. He was like, 2 dozen feet away or whatever. And it's like, that's on video. And so when you have a government entity like DHS, not just, doing what governments often do in these cases and sort of like saying, we defer comment, or like we dispute, we'll settle it in court. They're just denying obvious reality in ways that are demonstrably false and not supplying any sort of evidence for their position. That's what really gets me concerned, because it's one thing to as a litigation position dispute allegations. It's another to not deny reality and not provide any evidence for your position on the other side of it. And you mentioned that ProPublica article about the 170 U.S. citizens who had been documented as kind of detainees or arrestees, and it's like that was publicized online. DHS became aware of it, and the response was just to call it a fake news article. And it's like, well, you can call it fake news, but you have to have some evidence that it's fake. You can't just say that, right? Otherwise it's just he said, she said. And so, but the problem is the ProPublica people have resources and they have sources and they have evidence. And, if you look at like David Beer, we've been getting a lot of flack over at Cato, he's somebody who's been doing a lot of like tracking ICE and DHS data on immigration activity and sort of tracking the effectiveness of this activity over time. And there was a recent cache of data that came out from ICE from October 1st through November 15th of this year. So the most recent kind of set of ICE data. And that data is pretty striking because it shows that the proportion of people who are being detained by ICE who are non-criminals has dramatically gone up over the last few months, right? And in response to that data, which comes from ICE, you have DHS saying, here's David again with his fake news. And it's like, well, he's citing data coming from you. And your article, your press release about him or your tweets about him are not saying we have this other data that proves you're wrong. They're just calling him a fake news guy. And it's that kind of lack of seriousness that I think should be extremely concerning to anybody who's interested in the government, taking seriously their rights. Because if you talk to somebody during COVID, for example, like somebody on the right, like they wouldn't have trusted what the Biden administration was saying about like broad declarations about how dangerous COVID was and how we all need to lock down and stay home. Like they were extremely skeptical of those broad assertions of government power. But all of a sudden, when it's ICE and DHS making the same kinds of broad assertions of government power, the skepticism completely goes away. And it's really disheartening to see that.
I will add that DHS, for instance, when they've claimed, I think it was about George and maybe about you too, like you said, that they got violent or that interfered with an arrest or they assaulted the officers, and they keep saying these sort of the same things about other people, including U.S. citizens that have been arrested or detained. It's interesting that there are no charges filed after that. So I'm not aware, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think George was charged with assaulting a federal officer.
No.
Or that Leo was charged with any sort of federal crime or any crime at all after being released. So there is, if it were true that they got violent or whatever, and then their detainment or arrest was justified, then where are the charges?
Not only that, but you often see ICE bringing charges when cases, get media attention and then dropping them later, right? Yeah. So it's like, not only are you not seeing the charges on the front end that you expect to see if they were being serious about the conduct they're alleging, our clients were engaged in, but you wouldn't see them drop as many charges as they do after the attention dies down. And so there's a manipulation going on there too, of sort of the narrative around these cases. And I think you're right, what you were kind of implying a second ago about there being a bit of a script to the way they do things. You sort of see, like, if you get a lot of public skepticism or a story goes viral of a raid on a business or an apartment building or something like that, you'll often see, Tricia McLaughlin come out from DHS and say, oh, this was a targeted enforcement operation. It's always, this is a targeted operation. But, of course, a targeted operation is one that requires them to have advanced knowledge of who they're targeting. And at least from Leo's situation and some of the affidavits that we have, it doesn't seem like they had advanced knowledge of the people they were targeting. It seems instead like they just went to an active construction site and arrested all the people who looked Latino. That is not targeted in any meaningful way. And the same goes for these allegations of, that officers were engaged in a targeted operation and then Leo or George became violent or became aggressive and it's like, no, we know they didn't. Like, the evidence shows they didn't. You're just making this up.
And I think, part of what also concerns me is that, like you said, like I think you put it as they're denying reality. Yes, they are denying, not only are they denying reality, but they're telling people, I mean, in these there are videos, of these raids and these when ICE agents get violent and hit people and detain them in a very violent manner. The DHS is essentially saying no. They don't just deny reality themselves, but they're telling people, don't believe your eyes. The evidence that you're actually seeing right now, right in front of you, is somehow not true, and you have to believe what we say with, complete arbitrariness, with absolutely no evidence. So I personally, have never seen anything like this. This sort of, I guess people these days call it gaslighting, but truly it's like this absolute denial of reality and trying to rewrite reality, not just, in their own eyes, but in the eyes of the American public. And I think that is absolutely atrocious.
It is atrocious. It is. And the things that, I have been asking for, I tweet a little bit, we ask for things in our lawsuits. I speak publicly about some of this stuff. And like, my message has been pretty consistent across all these platforms, which is like, if the government sometimes makes mistakes, right? If it is sometimes sweeping up people like citizens who are not committing crimes in these dragnet rates, like, it should just admit that, right? And to see them just take this position like they never make mistakes or like none of this is happening, it's like, I can't grasp why a government that is serious about protecting individual rights would do that. And the answer is that they're not serious about it, right? They're not serious about, and even this notion, like if we put it in terms of sort of like make America great again, or like protect the homeland or protect citizens, like you're not doing that if you're violating the rights of citizens or people who are here otherwise lawfully, right? Following the laws of this country. And so like for me, it's not a big ask just to say that like, if you made a mistake, just say so and then say you'll try not to make them again in the future because you're focused on the illegal immigrants. But like, you can't even get yourself to say that. And it kind of goes the same for this point about like who they're actually detaining and deporting. I mentioned David Beer and his research and kind of some of his data analysis he's been doing. And like this most recent cache of data from ICE is really telling because it, if you kind of go look it up, he has a analysis that says 5% of the people that they are detaining right now at ICE over the last 45 days, only 5% of those are violent criminals, or at least been convicted of violent crimes. 73% are non-criminals, or at least haven't been convicted of any crime. About half, if you add in pending charges, only about half of them are folks who have pending or actual convictions. And so, like, I mention all this just because ICE has been doing this thing in its recruiting materials all over the internet. Like, they're paying a ton of money for advertising to say, join ICE, like, help us get the worst of the worst. We're going to go after the worst of the worst. But the data show they're not going after the worst of the worst. They're going after like all illegal immigrants, right? And even people who are not committing crimes, even people who are not hurting anybody or damaging property, just people who are here trying to work. Yes, they came here illegally, but they're trying to work and support their families. We're talking about like moms dropping their kids off at daycare, Leo going to construction jobs in Alabama. We're talking about people who are just trying to live their lives peacefully. Yes, they're here illegally, but like you cannot call them the worst of the worst and do that honestly because they are not the worst of the worst. They are in many ways the best of us.
Yes, and I think that these rights violations don't only occur with immigration enforcement and everything we're seeing, but I think the law itself is just a violation of rights of Americans and immigrants on their own. But we've talked about that before in this podcast. But Josh, I want to ask you, because this seems everything that's going on from the enforcement to the way that the government is communicating, but particularly the violation of the constitutional rights and the affront to the rule of law. This seems pretty unprecedented, or at least those of us who are very aware of what's going on. We haven't, at least I have never seen it in my lifetime. I've never seen anything like this. But I can recall some instances, similar instances, like comes to mind, for instance, the Mexican repatriation and, Japanese internment camps as sort of precedents for this behavior. But, well, I guess the first question is, do you think this behavior that we're seeing now, all across the board, especially the violations of rights, is it truly unprecedented? And I wonder what also courts have previously allowed law enforcement to do and the government to do in terms of, more like regular police enforcement, for instance, in terms of misconduct against Black people and warrantless entries in drug operations and things like that. So is there any precedent there?
I mean, there are some through lines to the past that we can maybe pull at. I don't, there's a sense in which it's unprecedented because I think that what's happening right now is happening at a scale that we may not have seen before in the United States, just given sort of population growth and the growth of government and the growth of resources available to conduct sort of mass enforcement operations. And so I don't have those numbers, but I would suspect that, like, at least in terms of scale, what we're seeing is pretty unprecedented. In terms of the nature of the enforcement, I don't think it's unprecedented. If you go back to even the American founding, one of the abuses that prompted the American Revolution was, customs officials in colonial Boston and other cities, being granted broad authority to ransack people's houses and storefronts and other property, looking for evidence that they had smuggled goods into the country, right? And so they were doing this without probable cause, without individualized suspicion, without, specific warrants describing the scope of a valid search. They were just sort of ransacking people's property, looking for the bad guys, looking for the crime. Now, I wouldn't call people who are, trading goods into the country bad guys, but at the time that was against the law. And so yeah, it is what it is. But so I think that the kinds of searches and seizures that they were engaged in at the founding that prompted the adoption of the Fourth Amendment are the kinds of things we're seeing today with ICE, right? And if you go back to, I hesitate to use this as an example because it may seem a bit inflammatory, and I don't mean it that way. But, when you have mass enforcement campaigns against whole categories of people, you can't help but think about, the Civil War. And prior to the Civil War, there were whole, groups of officials who were charged with, like, finding, fugitive slaves and enforcing, laws that kept slaves sort of like on their properties, right, under their owners' control. And I'm not calling ICE slave catchers or anything like that. My point is just that the tactics that were used were pretty aggressive enforcement tactics, because when you are enforcing, laws against an entire category of human being, right, you necessarily have to take pretty drastic enforcement measures to do that. And so it's not surprising to see ICE engaged in pretty dragnet tactics because they're targeting, by their own admission, right, in court cases like the Perdomo case, they're targeting people based on, like, demographic categories. And we're talking about millions and millions and millions of people who are sort of in the crosshairs right now. And so it's not surprising to see them engaged in pretty dragnet tactics when it comes to searching and seizing.
Yeah, and I think to what you just said, I guess it's part of the fact that immigration laws as they exist in this country, the majority of them are impossible to enforce without violating rights because they themselves, I think, violate rights.
Well, here's another example that I think, you mentioned, did you mention the war on drugs a second ago? Yeah, like, I mean, that's a good analogy here, actually, because I think, the possessor of a drug, right, is facially indistinguishable from the non-possessor of a drug, right? Like, I could have marijuana in my pocket right now or not, but I still look and sound like myself, right? And somebody could be here working on a construction site legally or illegally, but they're still going to look like a Hispanic construction worker, right? And so the point is, you cannot tell that those people are committing violations of the law, at least on the face of their activity. Nothing that they do, no way that they act is a sign that they are doing the thing that they're suspected of doing. You have to, like, pry into their life to find that out. You have to treat them differently to find that out. You have to search them. You have to seize them. And so when you have laws like that, laws that are, whether you're committing them or not, doesn't depend on whether you have violated someone else's rights, but depends on like a secret fact about you. Those kinds of laws are the kind that I think are most susceptible to arbitrary law enforcement.
So, Josh, both as an attorney and as someone who understands and cares about America's political principles, how do you see the current situation with immigration enforcement and the behavior of the government in terms of, so what does this do to our American political principles? How much damage do you think this is causing, and do you see a return to those principles?
Well, I think people should take heart in the fact that this is the kind of battle we've had before as a nation. As I mentioned earlier, I think it's, well, as you mentioned, we've had some pretty dark periods where, on racial grounds, you had police sort of enforcing laws in very aggressive ways and violating people's rights. I mentioned the American founding and the experience we had with customs officers and the pretty arbitrary searches and seizures we had back then that kind of helped birth the nation. So in various ways, we've had struggles with these kinds of things in the past, at different levels of intensity and at different scales. And so it's not like this is a foreign battle for us, right? We've overcome it before and we'll overcome it again. So I have optimism about that. I think it is a time to be pretty sensitive to the stakes because of the scale I mentioned earlier. It's something that I think is happening at a vastly increased scale from anything we've seen before. There's a kind of national fervor about all this right now. It's extremely hot button. The temperature is very high. The thing I think is the most potentially damaging to us long term is sort of the political culture this is cultivating and the perception people have of the government that it is cultivating. Because I go back to what we were talking about earlier with the sort of, why can't the government admit its mistakes here? Why can't it just be honest about reality? And it's not just that they're, we talked earlier about the fact that they're willing to whitewash reality and kind of gaslight what's really going on when presented with evidence about it. But the thing that really disturbs me is that they're doing it with a smile on their face. They're doing it with like a sort of glee and relish that almost like they're happy they can change reality just by saying something is what they say it is. And that to me is such a profound abdication of their responsibility as agents of the people in positions of power that it's hard to really wrap your head around. I mean, it is the ultimate inversion of what the government exists to do. The government exists to recognize reality, right? And in the real world, like in reality, the world we all live in, protect us from violence, protect us in the pursuit of our happiness. And if the government isn't willing to do step one, is not willing to live in reality, then everything else goes by the wayside, right? And we are suddenly in a situation where we have the institution with the most power in our society, the least moored to reality. And that is a really scary place to be. And so to the extent I hope that we come back from anything in this space, it's not that I lack optimism about our ability to overcome, abuses of the search and seizure power. We've done it before. We can do it again. We have a constitution for that. But I am very, very concerned about the government's disconnect from reality and whether, they're going to be aided and abetted by a substantial portion of the American population in that sort of whitewashing of reality or not.
So, Josh, IJ has been fighting government overreach for decades, and I am grateful that you guys are stepping up during this time to stop some of the grossest rights violations that we have seen in recent times and government behavior in general. Some of the grossest government behavior in general that we've seen in recent times, as you just mentioned. Obviously, not to take away from previous administrations that have been also violating the rights of Americans and immigrants alike.
Yeah, give them credit.
Yes. Also, like I'll say, as I have mentioned in other places, this is, in terms of immigration enforcement, this is not totally unprecedented, like including in recent times, the Obama administration laid the groundwork for this sort of even more stringent and more authoritarian enforcement to take place. But how important is it, do you think, for all of us to stand up to government power and this increasing authoritarianism that we're seeing? And how should regular citizens go about it? Because we know, IJ, you guys have the capacity to sue the government. How do you think we should all try to, make our rights respected and our voices heard in this time?
I think the number one thing, this hits on a bunch of things we've talked about today. The number one thing I think you can do as an ordinary citizen is to think for yourself. And I don't just mean weighing assertions the government makes or assertions that your family members make or that you see on X for yourself. I mean, like, doing the intellectual work to figure out what you think about an issue in earnest. And so, like, just to give you an example, if DHS is going to accuse somebody of David Beer of perpetuating fake news or fake data without citing anything on their own, like, you should assess that for what it is, which is a baseless assertion without any ties to evidence or reality, right? If they are going to cite statistics or data in response to something that David posts or anybody else posts, like, you can then assess who has the better of the argument, right? But the work has to be work that you do. And the thing that I've been the most concerned by in some of this stuff is that when I, share some information about my case with people, or, some of this other stuff we've talked about today with others, I'm often like either sort of dismissed or people cite to DHS press releases and say, oh, they said that you're lying. They said your case is a fake news case. And it's like, well, I'm here telling you that I've talked to this person. I'm here telling you that I have sworn affidavits from people that I've interviewed, right? That I've talked to them through like Spanish translators. Like, I've done the work of getting to know people on the ground who have suffered some of these abuses. And so, like, I have firsthand knowledge of some of this stuff, at least to the extent that I can have it, right? And on the other side, you have assertions from the government that are either completely baseless, right? In the sense that they're not relying on evidence, or flatly contradict the evidence that they're presented with. And so, like, why would you trust the government's assertions in this case and not me? And so you have to think through, like, why is that happening and why are people acting that way? And so the main thing I would recommend is, like, if you're dealing with somebody like that, try to bring them back to earth. I try to bring them back to reality. And the way that I think about it is, like, well, oftentimes people who are unwilling to hear out criticism of DHS, criticism of ICE, criticism of this administration are the same people who were all too happy to criticize the Biden administration during COVID. And, like, I have plenty of criticism for the Biden administration during COVID. I'm sure that you do too. And like, we should teach people to the extent that we can that the government is always capable of lying, whether it's on the right or the left. The government is always capable of using power, whether it's on the right or the left. And we should perpetually be a little bit skeptical of the government's assertions when it's claiming the authority to do things as potentially dangerous as mass immigration enforcement or mass lockdowns or mass anything, right? When the government is claiming that kind of power, do not just like in a servile fashion, swallow what it's saying without thought. You have to think for yourself. Otherwise, we're not going to have a country. Like, a country requires independent thinking citizens.
Josh, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And to our audience, some resources you may want to look at to learn more about our topic today are, for example, a talk that I gave earlier this year called Immigration Enforcement and the Betrayal of Due Process. We will leave the link in the show notes. And we will leave a link to a couple other articles that we have authored in the face of this increasing immigration enforcement across the board from the Trump administration, of which we only discuss a tiny fraction. As usual, please subscribe, comment, and share this episode on YouTube and other platforms, wherever you get your podcast. And you can always send us comments or questions at newideal@aynrand.org. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.